So here we are now, we're really going to get to the heart of the thing, of the theory of reasoned action and the theory of planned behavior by talking about the individual factors within the theories. And the first one here of part two is attitudes. This lecture is just going to focus on understanding what attitudes mean in this theory and how attitudes are calculated, because that's something you're going to be responsible for knowing, and it's something you'll actually also be doing. So again, as we're talking about attitudes in this theory, it's not just that, gee, I think recycling is good, or boy, I think smoking is bad, but we're talking about what we see as being the outcomes of a behavior. So smoking is good or smoking is bad is because of certain outcomes of that behavior. And to calculate outcomes, to think about outcomes, we have to look at two things. The first of those is belief evaluation. And this has to do with how positively or negatively we evaluate an individual outcome of a behavior, because there are many outcomes from a behavior. So if we're talking to teens about smoking, outcomes behaviors are everything from health effects, effects in their appearance, which we see as being things that are more likely to be negative, but also how this might affect social status, popularity, maturity, right? That is to say, how they are seen as being mature or how they'll feel mature, right? So, and are those things, so looking more mature, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Looking older, as in the sense of smoking ages your skin, is that a good thing or a bad thing? The health risks, are those good or are those bad? So it's going to be measured from a -3 to a +3. So that would be really good. People thinking I'm super popular would be awesome. +3, um, as opposed to my skin looking too old too early would be really bad. It'd be a -3. And this is the scale that we have. -3 to +3, and a person may just be a -1. For a given outcome, they might say, that'd be sort of bad, but they may not think it's terrible, because -3 would be terrible. So if I'm deciding whether or not I'm going to exercise this week or not, I recognize one of the outcomes has to do with weight management. So going to the gym would help me to manage my weight better, or working out would help me to manage my weight better. How good or bad would that be? It'd be pretty good. It's like a 2 maybe, right? +2, right? But the other part of this equation, as we're talking about attitudes and their outcomes, isn't just belief evaluation, but what the theory calls belief strength. And this is a person's perception that the outcome will actually happen to them. So they're evaluating the goodness or badness of the outcome under belief evaluation, but now under belief strength, do I think I'm going to realize, do I think I'm going to experience that actual outcome? So if we're talking to teens, if we talk about the health effects of smoking, and we talk about getting lung cancer, they might think getting lung cancer would be like a -2, sort of bad, but I bet they can just treat it. But the question is, do they think they'll get it? And if they think it's never going to happen to them, then it doesn't really matter how bad their belief evaluation is. It's not going to impact them much because they don't think it's ever going to happen to them. Whereas if they are somebody who's very concerned or conscious or aware of their health, and they're very concerned that maybe because of, like say me for instance, I lost my father to lung cancer, I know the real likelihood of getting lung cancer. So the fear of getting lung cancer as a negative outcome, right, is also impacted by the sense that I think it's likely to happen. And likelihood gets measured on a scale from 1 to 7. 7 being, I really think it's going to happen to me, and 1 being, I don't think it's going to happen to me, right? So we have those numbers. A person scores, let's say we're talking to a teen, and we're talking about the effects of smoking, and they say, and we're talking about lung cancer, and they say, well, I think that if you smoke getting lung cancer would be like a -2. Sort of a bummer, but also this is one of the things we see with young people often, their firm belief that medicine is always advancing and one day will save them really from their bad decisions, right? So they say it's a -2, sort of bad, but not the worst thing ever. But then if we ask them, how likely do you think it is to happen to you? Or we're asking, what's your belief strength? Well, they may only give it a 2. They might say, I don't think it's the most unlikely thing, which would be a 1, but they may not think that it's terribly likely. So what this theory does then is it says we need to multiply those scores. Belief evaluation times belief strength. Well, in this case, if we go and we multiply those, right, times 2, a negative times a positive is a negative. That's going to come up with, right, going to come up with a negative 4. I'm going to change colors there. It's going to come up with, right, a negative 4, right? So that's their score on this attitude component. And if you think about the maximum ranges here, right, if you think about what the maximum range is, if they had a, a positive 3 or a negative 3, but whatever the 3 is times 7, that's a 21. So what we're looking at is a score of negative 4 out of really is a possible of 21. And in that math, if you're not sure what I'm talking about the 21, we'll come back to that in a second, right? So this belief evaluation times belief strength gives us an individual, or gives us what we call an attitude component, right? And there are different things we could look at as different outcomes, again, of smoking, health effects, popularity, and so forth. So this person, one component of their attitude component would be negative 4, and what we're going to do is we're going to sum, and by sum I mean add up all of those components to see what is this person's attitude about smoking. And so if we're talking about, say, appearing more or being more popular because you're smoking, right? The cool kids smoke, and so that was a 2 for them, right? That was a 2, and they think that that is pretty likely to happen, which is a 4, right? Well, that then is going to equal, right? That will, for them, that will equal a positive 8, right? And so now we have this, this attitude component about being popular is a positive 8, and then the attitude component about getting lung cancer is negative 4. That means that the possibility of being more popular is, mathematically speaking, outweighing the fear of getting lung cancer. Right? So that's attitudes. We're going to look at this a little bit more in the next few slides here, looking at both how we measure it and then some more of how we do the math and what we do with this information. So as we go on to talk about attitudes, we're now going to look at how do we measure those, right? How do we ask survey questions to measure somebody's attitudes about a given behavior? So let's start by looking at one of the behaviors that this research on using TRA and TPB, which is theory of reasoned action, theory of planned behavior, have looked at many times, and one of those happens to be condom use. So to measure belief evaluation, we have to start by thinking about what are outcomes that people see associated with the use of condoms, both potentially good and potentially bad. And so, for instance, ruining the mood, right, quote unquote, ruining the mood during sex, right, having to, in the midst of sort of getting hot and heavy, to stop and locate and, if you will, apply a condom, right? And a person will score that as being on a scale from negative 3 to positive 3 as being extremely undesirable to extremely desirable, right? So ruining the mood during sex is really awful or really great. Okay, a person's probably not going to say it's really great, but there's a good chance that a person might say, oh, all things considered, ruining the mood, it's really only like a negative 1 because honestly, when two people are together, there is the dog scratching at the door, there's the cell phone, you didn't turn the ringer. I mean, it's like, listen, it's not like it's it's not something that can't be, overcome, right? So how bad or how good is ruining the mood during sex, right? That's belief evaluation. We're then going to look at belief strength. So we've established how they feel about ruining the mood during sex, but now we need to know whether or not they think that using a condom will actually ruin the mood during sex, right? So ruining the mood during, or using condoms will ruin the mood during sex. How bad is that? Again, is it highly unlikely or is it highly likely? And so if a person says, oh, I mean, it's just sort of, right? Well, that means then when we multiply those, right, if we go and we multiply those numbers by each other, right, what we're going to end up with, right, as we multiply them, what we'll end up with is a negative 2. So on the spectrum of things, that's not too much to dissuade a person from using condoms. Now, conversely, if you were to change this, right, if a person were to say that first off that they thought that ruining the mood during sex was really bad, I mean it's highly highly undesirable, right? It's a negative 3, and they think it's pretty likely to happen. Well, now all of a sudden, right, that negative 2 is no longer a negative 2, right? That negative 2 is now, because that negative 3 times positive 6, it's a negative 18. So that attitude alone is going to strongly dissuade this person, right? Dissuade, which is the opposite of persuade, right? Dissuade the person from using a condom during sex. Let's look at a second example. Now we're going to talk about recycling. So belief evaluations, and we're going to talk about recycling water bottles. So we'll ask a person, um, how good of a thing do you think it is to help the environment, right? It's extremely undesirable, it's extremely desirable. And so the person says, I don't know what the person says. They say helping the environment, it's a nice thing, and it's not the most important thing to them, but it's fairly desirable. They like the idea of that. We say, okay, so in terms of belief strength, recycling water bottles will help the environment. Now, a person might be concerned with helping the environment, but they may not think that recycling water bottles itself really does all that much, right? They may think that pouring toxic waste into rivers is really bad, but whether or not a water bottle goes into a trash can or not, a recycling bin, doesn't make much of a difference. So how much they care about helping the environment and how much they think that recycling a water bottle will help the environment, right? So then it's unlikely to likely, and they may just say, I mean, I guess it'll sort of do something. So it's a positive 3. So if we go and we multiply those things, right? What we see is that they then multiply it, those numbers by each other. What we end up with is a positive 6. So that sort of supports them doing it, but it doesn't support them as much as say if they thought that if they put the recycling bottle or they recycled the water bottle, that would do a lot for the environment. We'd see how that score would start going up a lot more because you're multiplying those numbers by each other. I hope that makes sense. We're going to look at another slide and another case and see how these numbers work out for one behavior looking at individual components. So here we're going to talk about texting and driving, right? And so we have a column for belief evaluation and belief strength and the product of those scores. And that far left column, what we're going to look at is what are possible outcomes of the behavior of texting and driving. And so a person may think that by texting and driving, they could cause an accident, they can kill someone, but also they can make plans. You make plans for the day, for what they're going to do that evening, right? Those are all possible outcomes. So we'll have them score, right? How good, how bad is each one of those things? And so let's say they say, well, causing an accident would be pretty bad, and killing someone would be pretty terrible, but making plans is a pretty good thing to do. That's how we end up with a -2, a -3, and a +2. Well, now the question is, how likely do you think those things are going to happen? And in this case, on a scale from 1 to 7, 7 being very likely and 1 being unlikely, this person thinks the odds of causing an accident while texting and driving is only a 2, right? Out of a possible 7, so not very high. They think that killing someone is a bit extreme. It's not, I mean, though killing a person would be pretty awful, be the worst thing that could happen, it's really the least likely thing to happen. They're giving it a 1. But making plans, which would be pretty nice to do, it's +2, and they think absolutely that is going to happen. So what we do is we multiply the items in those lines. So -2 times 2, -3 times 1, +2 times 7 gives us a 14. Right, so that's what we're looking at then. So causing an accident out of it only is a -2, really out of a possible -21. I'll show you that in a moment. Killing somebody is only -3, but making plans is a 14. And what you do, or we actually do in this, is we add up all those numbers, right? We add them all up. As we come out with here is a +9. So in terms of outcomes, the outcomes a person associates with texting and driving in this case actually supports them to text and drive. And all numbers are relative. So each one of these, right, each one of these numbers that we're looking at here, right, so we're talking about causing an accident, it's all relative, right? So that -1 is relative to have been a -3 or a +3, right? And so we get all the way across to where it's a -2, right? If we were to go through and we were to multiply, say, somebody thought causing an accident was very likely to happen, a +3 times a 7, that would have given a 21. So this -2, the -2 we're looking at, right, it's relative, right? It's all relative. In this case, it's relative between whether it was going to be a -21 or a +21, which is to say that causing an accident is dissuading them very minimally. Out of a possible 21, it's not doing very much. Just like killing somebody with a -3 is just barely dissuading them really at all. But that 14 means it's actually a fairly strong indicator or a fairly strong outcome that's going to persuade a person to actually then text and drive. And if you add up all those 21s, you end up with 63. So I have a possible score of -63 or +63. This person has a 9, which means more likely to text and drive than not. But you know, the number could be worse. It could be a 40. So there is low support for them texting and driving just based on the outcomes of the behavior. Now we're left with the really important question of what to do with these numbers, what to do with this information. So by looking at those scores, it can identify areas for change. So we'll look at belief evaluation from the previous slide that causing an accident while texting and driving is, right, we talked about undesirable and desirable. And let's say they had given it a -1. I think I had a different number on the previous slide, but let's say they had said it was a -1. And the likelihood of it happening, they said, was a 2, right, of a possible 7, right? Well, if we look at that information, right, on a scale there, right, so the belief evaluation there is a -1 out of a -3 to +3. The 2 is on a scale from 1 to 7. We see that these are not really doing much to discourage them from texting and driving. One of the things we can do is change a person's belief evaluation, right? We can help them to see that causing an accident while texting and driving is a bit more serious than giving it credit for. They're saying a -1 maybe because they think that getting into a car accident is just an inconvenience. They don't understand that getting into a car accident, first off, it's a major inconvenience. It can have long-lasting effects. I mean, people could live through accidents, but they can then have injuries that they themselves, as the one who caused the accident, deal with for years. Um, the loss of money associated with this can harm things like whether or not you finish your college degree. Anyway, the point is we could change how bad somebody thinks a behavior or an outcome is, or how good they think a behavior is. If they're thinking about dropping out of college, one thing we might do is tell them about, or help them to really understand just how much money will they make if they finish their college degree than if they don't. Right, so one of the things we can do is try to change that -1, get them to evaluate this behavior differently. So in the case of texting and driving, to see it as being a more serious thing. And to change belief strength. This goes back to if you think about EPPM, right, and severity and susceptibility, getting people to believe that not only is a thing that could happen bad, but that it is likely to happen to them. So people do a lot of, well, that would happen to other people, not to me, because I know what I'm doing. I can multitask well. By the way, the research says nobody's good at multitasking, right? I'm a good driver, right? This is one of the things that happens with not only texting and driving, but also with drinking, of people saying, well, that's because some people aren't good at doing it when they're texting, that is, say, driving. Some people aren't good at driving when they've been drinking, even though all the studies, those road test studies tell us that in both cases, people do a very bad job. And those two things are related because people who text and drive are as alert as people who are over the legal limit for alcohol, which is not a very good number, right? So we want to show people that even though you're young and smart and quick reflexes, that the likelihood of causing an accident when you text and drive is higher than you give it credit for. So we can move that number from a 2 up to maybe a 4. And so then if we can get that -1 to become a -2, right, that if we were working with these sort of these original numbers here, right, that -1, that +2 gives us a -2, right? But let's say with some work we got a person to see that getting into a car accident would be a -2, and that it was a bit more likely it was a 4. Well, then drawing those things together, right, if we draw those two things together, that score would come out to be a -8. And that will do more to dissuade them from texting and driving. Right? That's what you can do with it. You can look at these individual elements to change how do they perceive the outcomes of the behavior. And also, the sad part is when we do the full analysis of all the elements, attitudes, and subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control, it may be that the attitudes don't even matter. It could be that a person believes that texting and driving is very likely to cause an accident, which would be very bad. It's very likely to kill somebody, which would be horrendous. That it's not likely to help them make plans. They don't care much about doing that. Or we could have an attitude score that really was predictive of dissuading them from texting and driving, but it may turn out that attitudes are not even the deciding factor for this particular behavior. So I'm not trying to be pessimistic saying we're wasting our time. What I'm trying to say is that there are ways to use this data, but then sometimes it's not going to affect us as much as we think it will, because other factors like, say, subjective norms or perceived behavioral control will impact us more. So that is part 2 of the lecture and our discussion of attitudes. Next is a discussion of subjective norms.